You're listening to the Voice of Russia, Radio VR, with me, Juliet Spare, in London. For the first time in 200 years, a new victims' law could be introduced into England and Wales. It's being put forward by the former Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer QC, who's calling it a golden opportunity to recast the criminal justice system as a criminal justice system fit for victims. Keir Starmer is to advise the Labour Party on the best way to protect rape victims and abused children during court cases. But will a proposed victims' law make any difference? I'm joined by John and Penny Clough, whose daughter Jane was violently murdered by her ex-partner, who had been granted bail by a judge for raping her in 2010. And Rachel Holman, solicitor and head of the Domestic Violence and Forced Marriage Department Division of the Family Department at Watson Ramsbottom in Lancashire. First of all, I'd like to ask John and Penny, when Keir Starmer QC suggests a criminal justice system fit for victims, what would you advise him?
I would say yes, you're doing the right thing. And really, what we've always felt, it should be a victim justice system. Because what we see at the moment is a criminal justice system that isn't working. People are not reporting crime because of the way they are treated in court. People who are committing crimes are getting deplorable short sentences or community service. And the reasons that people are being let off with crimes are absolutely ridiculous. The law as it stands is an ass. And anything that can be done to put forward a system that improves the lot of victims has to be a good move.
Now, I briefly explained why I'd invited you to the discussion through your tragic experiences. John, tell me where specifically you think the criminal justice system failed you and your daughter.
We were failed because the judge failed to recognise the danger that Jane was in once she reported Jonathan Vass for the rapes and assaults he committed against her. Once she took that step, and that is the single hardest decision for any victim, to actually disclose and come forward and report their assailant. Once she made that decision and went public to the police, her risk factor went through the roof, and she deserved protection and the law to be proactive in that protection rather than giving her assailant his freedom and opportunity to ultimately kill her.
And for those who are unaware, would you mind telling us what happened?
Yeah, Jane had been in a relationship with Jonathan Vass. They'd met at work. And basically, Jane had fallen for a deception on the part of Vass. He was never the person he purported to be. He became a very controlling, manipulative and violent partner, which culminated in several rapes and violent assaults against Jane. Jane had a child, and when Vass assaulted her in front of the child, Jane realised that there was no way that she or the child were ever going to be safe. So at that point, she made the decision to go to the police and report him. We witnessed Jane go through weeks of interviews and recorded interviews with the police, taken away from her child, seeing the state that she came back in. And it was heartbreaking as a parent to see that, to see the pain and torment that she had to endure again in recalling all the horrendous acts that Vass had committed against her. At the point when the CPS appointed a barrister for Jane, the barrister had gone through some of the evidence that Jane had presented and had decided that a week court slot was too short and they needed a 2-week slot. And she also advised Jane that the impact of her testimony would be far more impactful if she gave it in person rather than by recorded means. When she agreed that, I believe that that's the time when Vass was notified that she was not going to back out, as he was depending on her doing.
But do you think that was the right advice?
Jane felt comfortable with it, and I think it was the right thing. What let her down was the judge's decision to allow Vass's freedom with basically no curtailments other than just telling him to keep out of Lancashire, keep out of the area where Jane lived. There was no monitoring, there was no protection afforded to Jane once Vass had been given bail. And that really, was the beginning of the end, because he knew that Jane wasn't going to back out. And he used the law then, because at the end the rape charges were placed on file after he murdered her, and I believe that that's the motive for the murder. He did not want to go to court and stand as a rapist, but he was prepared to go as a murderer, and the law allowed him to do that, and I think that's intrinsically wrong.
Rachel Holman, hearing that tragic story again, where could a victim's law help someone like Jane in this instance?
I think it could help her in a number of ways. In relation to giving live evidence, I think statistically you're more likely to get a guilty verdict if a victim does give live evidence in court rather than by video evidence and that type of thing. That's possibly an issue that we need to look at with juries. So I can understand the advice that was given in relation to that. I do think that there's a massive issue in relation to bail applications, and the victim doesn't particularly have any voice within the criminal justice system. They're just treated as a witness, as though it has nothing to do with them really. They aren't consulted, and their view, isn't really taken into account sufficiently at all, or if at all. So I think that there are changes. I also think that when somebody has been charged with such a serious crime as rape, that it's unrealistic to think that we can trust them to abide by bail conditions. In my view, there should be something in addition to that. I think that bail should very rarely be given in those circumstances, but where it is, I think it needs to be backed up with something like an electronic tag, so that if that person breaks the bail conditions, then the police are notified and action can be taken, because otherwise we're just trusting somebody like that to abide by them, and it's completely unrealistic.
Can I just add that?
Please, John.
Regarding bail, I think it's time there was another review of the Bail Act, and rather than the phrase it's assumed that bail will be granted, that the victim's right to safety should supersede that. And in cases of violence, or it seems ridiculous in this day and age that you can get somebody who's charged with murder who is then goes on to receive bail, because the risk of flight, the risk of further offences, interfering with witnesses is so great. And these are the only 2 of 4 items that a judge can use to remand somebody on bail. So it's time victim safety was uppermost rather than the defendant's right to freedom.
Penny.
Regarding victim safety, this is an easy thing to actually measure. When a victim goes to police and reports domestic violence, they are assessed for their risk. What risk are they of further harm? It's called a DASH assessment. All the police forces in the country do this. We have been saying that when it comes to granting of bail, the judge who is given this information from the police should be looking and either saying, what risk does the victim score at, so I can make an informed decision whether to grant bail or not, or it should be the CPS saying to the judge, the victim scores at this level, we advise they are not given bail. Now, if all the police forces are collating that information, if that information is already getting to the courts, why on earth isn't it being used? It's an absolute travesty. And, you know, when the police did the domestic homicide review on Jane, everything they said they'd done, they had done. They were marvellous. And again, it comes to the judge, Simon Newell, and he did not take into account at all the risk that Jane was at from Jonathan Vass, despite having that information in his bundle and despite being told by the CPS lawyers.
And as a family, you have to live with that decision for the rest of your lives. How do you cope with that?
Well, funnily enough, I was watching Oscar Pistorius on the TV this morning saying he can't sleep. Well, he ought to be Reva Steenkamp's parents and siblings, because I bet they can't sleep. It's very difficult. We get through day to day because time doesn't stop. And I think what drives us in kind of getting out of bed even is trying to make it different so other parents are not going through what we're going through, so other victims like Jane are not being put at risk through the lack of care, really, for victims within the justice system.
It's also trying to undo the damage that Judge Russell did in court when he described the 9 rapes and 4 assaults against Jane as insignificant in open court.
That killed us. We felt we'd been stabbed. We came out of court because he laid those charges on file. We came out of court absolutely devastated, because what we needed was Judge Russell to say, we can make this a positive case for Jane, we will try Vaz for the rapes, it is in the public interest to try him, and if he was convicted, we would have the satisfaction of knowing if this man ever got out, there would be at least measures in place that he was a convicted sex offender. The thought of Vaz getting out and tried for rapes absolutely devastates us, because any woman he comes across will be potentially a victim.
Rachel, then, is hearing this story a reflection on how society in Britain deals with domestic violence, in that it's almost incapable of putting victims at the heart? And I read in a recent article that said violence against women is a national crisis, and it needs struggle, resources and determination to overcome.
I would completely agree with that. I think it is a reflection of society. I think a lot of people turn the other cheek if they hear a neighbour perhaps in the middle of a violent argument, maybe don't ring the police. I think there's a culture of accepting that it goes on, and what goes on behind closed doors is nothing to do with anybody else. I think there's a massive problem with blaming the victims like we don't do with any other crime. If I was to report a burglary, nobody would ask me what I was wearing, did I have anything flashy in the window, that kind of thing. But if I was to report domestic violence or a rape, immediately the attention would be on me, and have I provoked that in some way. So I think that is a massive problem. There was a recent HMIC report into the police forces across England and Wales. Lancashire did very well in it, although I still see problems working in Lancashire with the police. But to me, these investigations are only looking at very tiny pockets of the whole system, and it is the whole system that needs to change. It's not just the police, which is still letting down victims of domestic abuse and rape. It's also the CPS, which quite often will look at what's the easiest charge I can prove rather than what's the most serious one available. And that's been highlighted recently as a problem. It's also the judiciary, who don't particularly have much training on domestic abuse or sexual offences, and still make embarrassing and inappropriate comments in court. And if we've got judges saying things like that, then it's not surprising that the jury and the other legal professionals in court will also follow suit in that way. So I think there's a huge job to be done. It will require money from the government, and it's okay saying, right, you know, we are going to make improvements. I mean, the HMIC report recommended that there was a similar investigation into lots of other agencies, including CPS, health, NHS, social services, all of those people who let down victims on a regular basis. So I do think it's something that we need to look at. I would also like to see more use of expert witnesses in court in cases of domestic violence and rape that can perhaps explain to the jury, because the jury are just, you know, 12 average people that have been picked off the street. They don't know anything about domestic abuse. They don't understand why victims don't leave straight away. They don't understand why maybe you don't report a rape straight away. And I think if use was made more of expert witnesses who can say in court, this is why some victims don't report straight away, this is why they don't leave straight away. And actually, victims are at the greatest risk of being murdered when they leave. So in a way, it's sensible that they don't leave to some extent. And when they do, they're then being let down by all the agencies by not having those protective measures in place.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with every word you've said there. I would say as Jane's parents, we wanted to come out of court with Jonathan Vaz having gone through a rape trial, so we could have felt that Jane had died for something. I think the way that the courts handled it and the way that judges described her rapes as insignificant when they were in fact the motive for murder, and that it wasn't, he made a statement as well saying it wasn't in the public interest to try Vaz. Why isn't it in the public interest? They can come out with these great statements but not have to justify what they've said. And, you know, I think Jane's case, if it had have gone properly, would have been a great thing for victims to kind of say, look, she had the courage to do this, he's been convicted, you know, this is good. But really, it's like, she reported rape, she's been murdered because the judge let her attacker out. The rapes were insignificant. Why on earth would you want to report rape?
It's exposed Jane's case, where it could have been landmark, has instead exposed almost every failure in the criminal justice system that is calling for this victim's law or something to be done to improve it.
And I think the thing is as well, how we see the justice system and judges in particular, they are not accountable for the decisions that they take. They would hold us accountable as members of the public for things that we did wrong that would cause harm to another person, but they themselves are not accountable. This has got to stop. We live in a democracy, and here we have the most autonomous people on earth, judges, who can do really what they want in a court regarding decisions and get away with it. They can say what they want and not have to explain how they've come to that decision. It is so wrong.
To me, accountability is about the accepting of consequences when things go wrong. And to me, there are no consequences when a judge makes an ill thought out decision. If there are no consequences, to me there are no incentives to do it right, because it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Nothing will happen to the judge. I'm not looking for ways to sack judges, although that would be something worth talking about, but it's looking at ways judges can relearn. If a judge has a training for a certain aspect of law, once he's done the training course, which may or may not just be a tick box exercise as far as I'm concerned, who mentors them? Who decides that they're competent then to sit on those cases? Because in my opinion, Judge Newell was not competent to sit on Jane's case. He made a statement to say that he was unaware that Jane had any fear of her attacker. Now, if someone's reported 4 assaults and 9 rapes, and he doesn't think that person is scared, that training that the judge has gone through is seriously lacking and not fit for purpose. I have tried to get access and witness some of these training, but it is such an untransparent process. Nobody is willing to discuss this with us, and I think it's because there's something to hide.
It's completely inadequate if it isn't working. And in any other realm of society, if something isn't working, things are done to make it different. And again, this is why Keir Starmer's doing a good thing in proposing victims' laws. It was great that Louise Casey proposed victims' codes, but really it needs to go that extra step where victims actually need the same laws to protect them that the defendants have to support them.
That's what I was going to ask. After what you just said there, John, is this victims' law enough? And the transparency for judges receiving training goes back to what you said, Rachel, about the call for more expert witnesses being used to almost highlight the issues and educating the judge and jury. Yeah. But then that goes back to what I said about the way Britain perceives, or the world perceives, domestic violence. In that it's not understood, or not enough onus is ever put on the victims, or nothing is, the psychological journey that a victim goes through is not given enough weight. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think for a judge not to remain unaccountable, I would be happy with that if it could be proved the judge was infallible. But a judge is a man or a woman and can make mistakes, and accountability is a process that can acknowledge those mistakes. Accountability is a process that allows people to learn from those mistakes and to improve their decision-making process. I cannot understand why they are completely unaccountable.
To me, it took 2 people to let a murder happen. Jonathan Vaz to do it, and a judge and his bad decision to let him.
And do you ever have any communication with the judge?
I do send him the odd letter where I kind of explain how we feel, how hard it has been. The things like that we've had to adopt Jane's baby to protect her from her evil daddy. And the rights that he had because his name was on the birth certificate. And we always believed that he'd come to kill Jane's baby, and so did the police. And the only way we could really take away his rights of knowing where she was, what school she was at, was to go through the adoption process. And that took an incredible amount of money. How many people can afford to do that? We've heard cases where mums have had to adopt their own children to protect them from their abusive father. And that is absolutely insane. And, when these things happen, the criminal justice system should be coming at you and saying, we can help you with this, we can get you through that. Have you considered doing this? And there is absolutely none of it. We thought when Jane died, somebody would come and say, sorry, this is why it's happened. This is what we're going to do to stop it happening again. And there is absolutely none of it because there is not accountability up there.
Keir Starmer once said something at a conference we were at, and it was about campaign groups and how things change in the legal system. And the thing is, every change that happens is all victim-led. Victims have to fight for every single thing. There is nobody on the Ministry of Justice side that looks at situations and thinks, that is wrong, we need to do something about it. They will never do anything unless a victim speaks about it.
I think we've got a Victims Commissioner, Baroness Helen Newlove. She's employed by the Ministry of Justice for 20 hours a week. This lady is so busy that she cannot even make time to take questions at conferences where victims and victim support groups attend. It's absolutely ludicrous because she will talk about the victim's voice, and yet how on earth can she get down to victim level, even though she's been a victim herself and knows the importance of this, when she's got to go to London.
I mean, we used the word victim, talked a lot about victim, and this victim's law. Is it going to go far enough? Or is this the first step?
I think it's the first step, and we obviously don't know what that's going to recommend because it's still in a consultation process. But we touched upon the family law system, for example, which this probably won't address. And the family law system, which I see every day, is often used by perpetrators of domestic violence to persecute the victim again. So, you know, they may have gone through the criminal justice system, they may have been convicted or not convicted, but they've still got the right to then take the mother to court for contact with the child, almost regardless of whatever has been perpetrated against her. And although I would hope that the application would be refused, she still has to go through all that trauma. And again, that trauma might take 9 months, 12 months, so it just continues. The other thing that I think that is important is that many people don't realise that there is no criminal offence of domestic violence, and there is a campaign at the moment to bring that into being. So at the moment, other laws have to be used, such as assault and false imprisonment. What groups like Paladin are campaigning for is to make a specific offence of domestic abuse or domestic violence so that prosecutions can be brought before it becomes physical. So psychological abuse will be taken into account. And to me, that's essential so that we don't need to wait until it gets to serious violence or rape. We can actually take action straight away. And I see lots of clients who have been to the police about psychological abuse and told, come back when it hits you. And that's just not good enough.
John?
The way I see the Ministry of Justice at the moment is that it holds all victims with a degree of contempt that is insulting. The facilities that the Ministry of Justice puts forward for victim support is less than 1% of the Ministry of Justice budget. We had a full-time Victims Commissioner with Louise Casey, and she had a fully funded staff and department. They have given us now effectively a part-time Victims Commissioner with a fraction of the budget. That again speaks of huge contempt. Why do victims have any faith in what the Ministry of Justice are trying to do for victims? Chris Grayling has been trying to cut victim support for victims of for bereaved victims who had family murdered prior to April 2010. At what point does someone stop grieving? At what point does somebody stop needing support? It's a completely ludicrous premise that you can put a date stamp on it and say after that date you don't need any support. We need more support. We need you to stop pandering to criminals in prison, giving them their home comforts. Take the rights of litigation away from prisoners for when they get at scratch so they can stop compensation claims. Give that money to victims groups, victim support. They need it more. You talk about rehabilitation for criminals. Well, I'll give you some news. Victims need rehabilitation too. And we need it a damn sight more than they do. So pull your finger out. Give us something that we need instead of something that you think we need. Ask us what we want. And hopefully some of the plans that Keir Starmer will come out with will benefit us all as victims.
Penny, finally, you've got the Justice for Jane campaign, the White Ribbon campaign. What gets you up in the morning? What still makes you keep going?
I think the thing that keeps us going is knowing that there are so many victims out there that are in Jane's position or will be in Jane's position. It is such a humongous problem, domestic violence. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men are potential victims, and more needs to be done. There are people out there who don't even realise they are victims of domestic abuse. We need to educate them and say, get out now. well, you can. And for the victims that are in relationships or what have you, have kids, need a roof over their head, there's a lot of help at ground level that can help support you if you want to take that next step. It's so important that we actually tackle in the workplace that, some of your employees will be victims of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and they need help. You might see them as being off sick again, but who rings in and says they've been raped or been hit? There's got to be a lot more recognition. Things need to happen. Keir Starmer is taking a step in the right direction, and to us, we would have loved it to have been 30 years ago, because that might have saved Jane. But we've got to take steps somewhere, and we've got to drive it forward. And it is the victims that will be the driving force behind this, and the people that care about victims. At least Keir Starmer is listening to victims, and I really applaud him for that. I think he's in an ideal position with his legal knowledge, with his previous work within the criminal justice system. Fantastic. I applaud the man.
Please, yeah, of course.
The majority of perpetrators in domestic violence tend to be men, and as a man, I find that very distressing. I have recently become an ambassador for a campaign called the White Ribbon Campaign, which is a group of people who are prepared to make a stand, make a pledge that they will never stand by and condone, commit, allow any violence against women.
Or their partner.
We need support. It's a great campaign. If you would like to just Google White Ribbon Campaign, you can have a look at the website. You can perhaps add your pledge. We would like to see many, many more men take part in this. Women can can take a look as well. They can also sign the pledge, but unfortunately, it is a male environment, and we will always speak up against violence against women and girls.
On that note, I'm going to have to finish the discussion. I'm extremely grateful for John and Penny Clough for joining us on The Voice of Russia, and Rachel Horman, solicitor at Watson Ramsbottom. Thanks very much. Now, I briefly explained why I'd invited you to the discussion through your tragic experiences. John, tell me where specifically you think the criminal justice system failed you and your daughter.
We were failed because the judge failed to recognise the danger that Jane was in once she reported Jonathan Vass for the rapes and assaults he committed against her. Once she took that step, and that is the single hardest decision for any victim, to actually disclose and come forward and report their assailant. Once she made that decision and went public to the police, her risk factor went through the roof, and she deserved protection and the law to be proactive in that protection, rather than giving her assailant his freedom and opportunity to ultimately kill her.
And for those who are unaware, would you mind telling us what happened?
Yeah, Jane had been in a relationship with Jonathan Vass. They'd met at work, and basically Jane had fallen for a deception on the part of Vass. He was never the person he purported to be. He became a very controlling, manipulative and violent partner, which culminated in several rapes and violent assault.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia, Radio VR, with me, Juliet Spare, in London. For the first time in 200 years, a new victims law could be introduced into England and Wales. It's being put forward by the former Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer QC, who's calling it a golden opportunity to recast the criminal justice system as a criminal justice system fit for victims. Keir Starmer is to advise the Labour Party on the best way to protect rape victims and abused children during court cases. But will a proposed victims' law make any difference? I'm joined by John and Penny Clough, whose daughter Jane was violently murdered by her ex-partner, who had been granted bail by a judge for raping her in 2010. And Rachel Holman, solicitor and head of the Domestic Violence and Forced Marriage Department Division of the Family Department at Watson Ramsbottom in Lancashire. First of all, I'd like to ask John and Penny, when Keir Starmer QC suggests a criminal justice system fit for victims, what would you advise him?
I would say, yes, you're doing the right thing. And really, what we've always felt, it should be a victim justice system. Because what we see at the moment is a criminal justice system that isn't working. People are not reporting crime because of the way they are treated in court. People who are committing crimes are getting deplorable short sentences or community service. And the reasons that people are being let off with crimes are absolutely ridiculous. The law as it stands is an ass. And anything that can be done to put forward a system that improves the lot of victims has to be a good move.
It's against Jane. Jane had a child, and when Vass assaulted her in front of the child, Jane realised that there was no way that she or the child were ever going to be safe. So at that point, she made the decision to go to the police and report him. We witnessed Jane go through weeks of interviews and recorded interviews with the police, taken away from her child, seeing the state that she came back in. And it was heartbreaking as a parent to see that, to see the pain and torment that she had to endure again in recalling all the horrendous